Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Not nights, not plagues, not dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own questionable genetics. Something soft, something warm, something that, ironically, nobody in the Middle Ages wanted to do, but absolutely had to. Welcome to a long, slow, meandering dive into medieval laundry. So go ahead, dim the lights, fluff the pillows, unclench whatever you've been clenching all day, and settle in. Because tonight, we're exploring how medieval folks washed, dried, bleached, beat, scrubbed, boiled, and occasionally prayed over their clothes. Very slowly, very calmly, with absolutely no urgency whatsoever. And honestly, it's more chaotic than you'd expect. But don't worry, we'll drift through it all, one damp linen shirt at a time. Let us glide in gently with a simple fact. Laundry in the Middle Ages was a problem. A real one. Not like my dryer shrank my sweater levels of problem. More like my shirt has been fermenting under my bed for 3 months and now has its own personality kind of problem. Clothes, as a rule, did not get washed often. People prefer to wash themselves less than their clothing, which, you know, is a bold hygiene strategy, but okay. But when laundry did happen, it was a massive event. The medieval version of Laundry Day was basically the Super Bowl of domestic suffering. So tonight, we're taking this slow, sleepy journey into what medieval people used to wash clothes, how they washed them, where they dried them, who did the ironing spoiler. Not many people land what bizarre rules and rituals inevitably grew around all of it. We're floating right into the heart of medieval textile chaos. Let's ease ourselves into the world of fabric first. You can't understand medieval laundry unless you know what they were washing. Clothes were mostly linen, wool, or something that claimed to be wool, but definitely had some mystery fibers from a goat named Bernard. Cotton wasn't common in Europe yet, and silk. Well, silk was strictly for the I don't actually do my own laundry crowd. Linen was the star of the laundering show. It was absorbent, durable, and, crucially, bleachable. This matters because medieval people had a deep relationship with a substance called lye, which is basically crushed up plant ash with the attitude of a mild industrial cleaner. Linen could survive lye. Wool could not. Wool had a tendency to shrink, felt, or scream internally when treated too harshly. This meant laundry came in 2 categories: the stuff you could actually wash, and the stuff you pretended didn't need washing. Spoiler for category 2, medieval people had a lot of pretend. Now let's drift into the slow, bubbly world of soaps and detergent soar. Whatever counted as detergent before anyone invented the concept of fresh lemon scent. The main cleaning agent was lye. And medieval lye was a whole personality made from wood ashes mixed with water, left to solubilize into a mush, tested by dropping an egg or a potato in it. If it floated, your lye was ready, because yes, science. Congratulations, you now have a highly basic chemical substance capable of dissolving stains, grease, and possibly your hands. If you were fancy, you added a bit of animal fat and made something that resembled soap. If you weren't fancy, you just used ash water and hoped for the best. And honestly, for a lot of medieval peasants, the best was simply the shirt doesn't collapse into dust. Other exciting medieval detergents included stale urine, more stale urine, and extremely stale urine stored in a communal barrel. Because ammonia cleans things, and medieval people discovered this by living in the Middle Ages. Imagine having to explain to your neighbors that you keep a bucket of household pee specifically for treating stains on your husband's tunic. A strong smell, but a strong marriage. Let's all just take a cozy, sleepy moment to appreciate modern washing machines. Speaking of water, you'd think the medieval laundry process would fetch some clean water. But no. This is a world where the drinking water occasionally came with bonus parasites. So naturally, laundry water came from wherever the local medieval government wasn't actively forbidding people from dumping things. Laundresses, often women working communally, headed down to rivers, streams, ponds, or any body of water that wasn't actively boiling. They preferred running water because it rinsed better, and because still water was usually a polite way of saying this puddle has been here since Charlemagne. Imagine kneeling at the edge of a chilly river, holding linens in early spring. The water is so cold, it makes your bones reconsider being bones. But this was normal, even expected. Laundry was a social activity. If your definition of social includes gossiping while clubbing woolen shirts with a wooden paddle. Ah, yes. The washing beater, the medieval laundry MVP. A smooth plank, shaped like a cricket bat, that failed its dreams and became a domestic tool instead. Laundresses used it to pound dirt out of fabric, or maybe to take out their frustrations on the shirt of someone who annoyed them politically. We don't know. We can only imagine. Picture this: a line of women along the riverbank, a pile of linens that could swallow a horse, everyone rhythmically thwacking fabric against a big, flat stone. Somehow, the sound is both soothing and threatening. Very ASMR. Very do not cross your laundress. And in all seriousness, this method worked. Clothes genuinely came out cleaner. Eventually, after several hours of beating, soaking, rinsing, wringing, beating again, rinsing again, let's drift into the gentle, soggy realm of soaking vats. Because after beating clothes half to death, medieval people then soaked them in big wooden tubs filled with warm water, lye, herbs, or whatever the local laundress swore by. Some added lavender, some added thyme, some probably added things they found in the kitchen without asking questions. A little rosemary for scent, a little sage because someone's grandmother swore it worked, and probably a little superstition tossed in for good measure. Clothes sat there for hours, sometimes overnight, sometimes longer if the weather was bad or if someone simply forgot. Laundry was not fast. Laundry was a journey. Now let's slowly float over to the topic of drying clothes, which was a whole other adventure. No dryers, no heated racks, no delicate cycle, just air and time, and the occasional goose walking over your freshly cleaned linens because boundaries didn't exist yet. Clothes were hung over bushes, wooden racks, ropes, hedges, fences, barn doors, or anything that didn't move. If you lived in a town, you might hang things out the window, which meant your drying shirt might casually drip onto the person walking below. Very refreshing, very aromatic. In some communities, people set aside common areas just for drying laundry. Imagine a field full of drying linen, shirts flapping gently in the breeze. You'd think it looked peaceful, and it probably did. Right up until a sudden rainstorm reminded everyone that nature had no respect for human schedules. Laundresses developed an instinctively accurate weather sense. They could smell a storm brewing 6 towns away. It was either magic or trauma, and now sliding ever so calmly into the realm of ironing, which medieval people technically did. Just not in the way you're imagining. First of all, linen dries stiff, like it could stand up and walk away if it had feet stiff. So medieval people didn't so much iron their clothes as break them in. They used objects called mangles, which were big rollers that pressed fabric flat, or linen smoothers, which were polished stones or pieces of glass that looked like they wanted to be paperweights when they grew up. You'd pick up your stiff linen, lay it flat, and then rub it with your little stone friend until the fabric submitted to your will. If you were wealthy, I Dan T, do my own laundry because I have servants, and a questionable moral framework. Wealthy might have a metal iron, but heating one of those required placing it in the fire. And when you pull a metal object out of a fire, it is, shockingly, very hot. One wrong move, and congratulations, you've branded your favorite shirt. And because the Middle Ages loved efficiency, some irons were hollow. You'd put hot coals inside them. Nothing says relaxing quite like carefully smoothing a sleeve while bits of burning coal rattle around next to your fingers. Let's relax our way into talking about who did the laundry. Because this is where things get socially interesting in a very slow, very soft way. Women did the laundry. Almost always. Whether they were wives, servants, laundresses, for hire, nuns, or unlucky daughters who tried to pretend they didn't hear their mother calling. Laundry was a female domain. Professional laundresses were everywhere, especially in towns. They were respected for their skill, feared for their gossip, and perpetually annoyed at everyone's unrealistic expectations. Royal households had entire teams dedicated just to linen. King sheets, queens, chemises, baby princes, tiny, weirdly expensive diapers was all handled by staff who absolutely were not paid enough for dealing with royal laundry in a time before deodorant. Monasteries had their own routines, too. Imagine monks quietly folding laundry in silence for hours. It's a weird mental image, but somehow soothing. At this point, we should gently acknowledge something. Laundry was not clean work. Laundry made things clean, but the process itself was a swamp of damp fabric and questionable smells, and frequently involved hauling buckets that weighed more than your average medieval toddler. Add to that river mud, soap scum, lye burns, and the occasional eel that thought your washing stone looked like a nice place to nap. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary, and it shaped daily life far more than most people realize. Let us take a slow breath and drift deeper into the process, because medieval laundry wasn't a weekly thing. It wasn't even a monthly thing. Laundry happened in big, dramatic, seasonal batches. Spring laundry, summer laundry, maybe autumn laundry if you were feeling ambitious. Winter laundry, absolutely not. The rivers were frozen, and so were the laundresses. For most people, this meant accumulating an entire pile of dirty clothing and linens weeks, sometimes months worth, and then tackling it all at once. Picture it, a village-wide laundry day. Everyone brings out their piles of textiles. Children run around, helping by tripping over everything. Geese supervise with judgment. Men mysteriously vanish to go check fences or chase rabbits or whatever other excuse medieval men used to leave the chores to women. Laundry season was an event, a slightly miserable one, but also communal, social, and kind of bonding. In a world without social media, laundry gossip was the Twitter feed of rural life. Let slowly glide into one of the sleepiest little details of medieval laundry life: bleaching fields, also called bleach greens. These were grassy lawns where clean, wet linen was spread flat under the sun to lighten and disinfect it. Imagine a meadow full of wide, pale sheets gently soaking up the light, quiet, still, a small breeze brushing over them. The world calm for a moment. Very aesthetic. very Instagrammable life Instagram existed and wasn't 800 years away. People believed sunlight had cleansing power, and honestly, they were right. Sheets could spend hours or even days out on the bleached green, getting brighter, fresher, and surprisingly vulnerable to being stolen by passing travelers who needed an extra blanket. Because even in the Middle Ages, laundry theft was a thing. Before we drift toward a close for part 1, let's gently settle into one last topic. Why did medieval people worry so much about laundry, even though they washed so infrequently? Because linen was everything. Not knitted t-shirts, not polyester hoodies. Linen, it was underwear, it was bed sheets, it was tablecloths, it was towels, it was napkins. It was basically the medieval version of everything in your house that touches your skin. And linen, when it gets dirty, gets very dirty. So even if outer garments barely got washed, underwear and linens, absolutely, eventually, this created a strange paradox. Medieval people didn't wash often, but when they did a lot. It was exhausting, it was time-consuming, it was messy, but it was also a small glimpse of everyday life's soft, slow, repetitive work that shaped the rhythm of medieval households. And now, as we wrap up this first part, you can picture it, a riverside, sheets hanging in the breeze, a wooden beater tapping rhythmically against a washing stone, water swirling around pale linen, quiet conversations drifting above the current, the slow choreography of a chore that has existed for thousands of years.
Hey again, guys. Let's just slide right back into the riverbank mud where we left off. Take a slow breath, unclench your jaw, and imagine you're holding a damp, medieval shirt that probably hasn't seen soap since Easter. Perfect. We're back. Tonight, we're continuing our soft, overly detailed journey through medieval laundry, which, for something as mundane as washing clothes, manages to involve chemicals, superstition, boiling cauldrons, social hierarchies, and more life philosophies than a modern self-help book. Nothing exciting, though. No drama. Just the gentle, comforting horror of centuries-old stains. Let's ease in. Stain removal, Medieval Edition. Medieval people had one goal when it came to stains. Pretend the stain didn't exist until pretending wasn't an option. But when reality finally won, they reached for whatever they had on hand, which, as you can imagine, varied wildly. Here are some of the more soothingly strange medieval stain removers. 1. Bread. Yes, bread. If you spilled grease on your linen shirt, the recommended method was rubbing it with stale bread. This feels less like a cleaning technique and more like the world's saddest lunch, but it was surprisingly effective at absorbing oil. 2. Vinegar, the medieval cure-all. Vinegar was like the Windex of the Middle Ages. Stains? Vinegar. Sweat smell? Vinegar. Your husband complaining? Maybe vinegar. 3. Sour milk. This was used to whiten linen. Imagine opening a bucket of old milk and thinking, yes, this will fix my wardrobe. 4. Human urine. We already dipped our toes into this earlier, but it deserves a calm, leisurely revisit. Urine was so useful that cities had laws requiring households to donate their supply to professional laundresses. Imagine the town crier announcing, "Good citizens, please empty your family's contribution into the official pee barrel by sundown." Very dignified, very aromatic. 5. Herbs that may or may not have worked. Medieval stain removal manuals read like someone raided the back of a pantry while mildly delirious. Mint for cloth smells, yolks for ink stains, crushed ivy leaves for general sadness, and sometimes honey, because why not make everything stickier before washing it? The guiding philosophy seems to have been, if it's in the yard or kitchen, rub it on the shirt. Boiling, the medieval washing machine. After stains were handled, clothes often went into a massive cauldron for boiling. Yes, boiling. Imagine a witch's cauldron, except instead of curses and frogs' legs, it's full of shirts, chemises, pillowcases, and every regret someone's worn for the last 2 months. The water was heated over a fire. The lye went in. Herbs went in. Sometimes urine went in. Again. Then the fabric was lowered with a long stick, stirred slowly, and left to cook like a bland textile soup. And here's the best part. Not all fabrics survived this. Some came out beautifully clean. Others emerged looking like something a medieval cat dragged through a hedge for fun. Some shrank. Some lost color. Some just gave up on existence. Laundry day was a gamble. A relaxing, slow-moving gamble, with permanently high stakes. Let's float into castle laundry. Most people imagine castles full of luxury. Gold, silk, courtiers swanning around like they're in a perfume commercial. But the castle laundry room? Oh no. It was wet, dark, cold, and very, very busy. A large castle could produce mountains of dirty linen, sheets, shirts, tablecloths, wall coverings, aprons, undergarments, and the personal clothing of dozens or even hundreds of residents. And because nobles insisted on changing their shirts daily, which was their idea of being hygienic, the laundry workload was enormous. Castle laundresses weren't just boiling clothes. They were scrubbing stains off expensive fabrics they couldn't afford to replace, mending tears, drying huge sheets in narrow courtyards, and smoothing wrinkles with hot stones. Imagine standing in a stone room, steam rising, cauldrons bubbling, heat from the fire turning the walls into a medieval sauna. Except you're not relaxing. You're washing the Duke's table linens while hoping you don't set them on fire. The wardrobe master, the unpaid therapist of laundry. In wealthy households, someone had the delightful job title of keeper of the wardrobe. This person was responsible for the noble's entire closet, not just storing clothes, oh no. They were responsible for tracking what needed washing, approving detergents and methods, checking for moth damage, making sure the expensive tunics didn't fade or shrink, keeping inventory, and dealing with the noble's complaints. Imagine waking up one morning to a baron shouting, "Why is my sleeve slightly less crisp than yesterday?" Very calm, very centered, very, "I need a new job." The wardrobe master kept detailed notes, genuinely detailed. Some inventories tell us the exact number of shirts a noble owned, how many buttons each had, which ones had stains, which were slightly scorched by the iron, and which were awaiting new embroidery because someone got too close to a candle. Nobles created more laundry work than toddlers, and that's impressive. Let's drift over to monastic laundry. Monasteries are probably the most soothing environment we'll cover tonight. Picture rows of monks, each in quiet contemplation, their robes drying on a line as the bell tolls softly somewhere in the distance. Laundry in a monastery wasn't rushed. It wasn't chaotic. It was simply part of the cycle of life. Monks washed their clothes in predictable rhythms, often weekly or bi-weekly, because cleanliness was considered next to godliness, and also because wool robes get fragrant fairly quickly. They used cool water from cloister wells, gentle lye soap, herbal rinses, and a lot of patience. No gossip, no complaining, just a silent line of men calmly squeezing water from fabric. Honestly, if there had been a medieval travel brochure, monastic laundry would have been a top-tier spa experience. Laundry on the road, soldiers and camp followers. Now let's slowly wander into a more chaotic but still gently narrated world. Laundry during military campaigns. Soldiers wore wool, heavy wool, sweaty wool, the kind of wool that feels alive after a week. And they had one method for washing it: find water and hope for the best. Campaign laundry consisted of dunking clothes in rivers, beating them on rocks, wringing them out while swearing softly, and then drying them on bushes while praying nobody stole them. Often, washing was done by camp followers, women who traveled with the army to cook, mend, and clean. They were paid in coin, food, or whatever the soldiers found during raids. Their laundry work kept the army functioning, or at least slightly less disgusting. Imagine a field full of soldiers' shirts flapping in the breeze, surrounded by the smell of campfire smoke and wet wool. Very scenic, very rustic, very I wish I were anywhere else. Town life, public washhouses. Urban areas had their own system, washhouses or laundering sheds. These were communal buildings with covered water troughs, something between a spa, a workplace, and a gossip center. Professional laundresses worked there all day, soaking clothes, beating them, rinsing them in flowing water channels, hanging them to dry on racks, and exchanging every piece of neighborhood gossip ever recorded. Medieval people didn't have social media. They had laundresses. You wanted news? You went to the washhouse. Births, deaths, affairs, who was fighting whom, who spilled soup on themselves at dinner. Laundresses knew it all. Imagine the slow rhythm of scrubbing and rinsing mixed with a low hum of whispered stories. Very comforting. Very relatable. Let's gently glide into laundry superstition, because of course medieval laundry had rules. And not practical rules, no, magical ones. 1. Never wash clothes on certain saints' days. Why? Because someone's grandmother said bad things would happen, and that was enough. 2. Washing after sunset was unlucky. Spirits, demons, or just people fearing ghosts among the laundry lines. Take your pick. 3. Washing a baby's clothes too often made the child weak. This was probably invented by a tired mother who didn't want to do laundry that week. 4. Never wash clothes during thunderstorms. Not because it was dangerous, just because thunder was seen as a sign God was already annoyed, and adding laundry to the list felt rude. These superstitions served one purpose: giving people socially acceptable excuses to avoid doing laundry. Honestly, respect. The sounds and sights of medieval laundry day. Since our goal here is sleep, let's slow down and paint the scene. Picture a river, the quiet ripple of water, cloth dipping in and out with a gentle splash, a wooden beater tapping rhythmically like a slow metronome, wind moving softly through drying linens, muted conversations drifting like the breeze, the distant clucking of a chicken who's wandered too close, the soft scrape of smooth stones rubbing fabric, the whistle of a kettle heating water nearby. Laundry wasn't fast. It wasn't glamorous, but it was strangely peaceful in a monotonous, repetitive, hypnotic sort of way. Exactly the kind of thing that makes your eyelids heavy as someone talks about it for several hours. Which is, frankly, the entire point of this video. Hey guys, welcome back. Let's stretch our shoulders, breathe a little slower, maybe look vaguely toward the nearest pillow. Tonight, we're slipping deeper into the soft, lukewarm bathwater of medieval laundry, which somehow keeps getting weirder the longer we talk about it. Perfect for sleep. Terrible for actually doing laundry. All right, let's drift in. Laundry as social status, because even washing clothes had hierarchies. In the Middle Ages, you couldn't just wash clothes. Oh no, laundry was a whole ecosystem of class expectations. If you were poor, you washed your own clothes, probably in a river, probably while trying not to freeze, and probably while pretending your waterlogged wool tunic wasn't actively plotting to take you down with it. If you were moderately comfortable, you might send things to a local laundress. She'd soak, scrub, beat, boil, rinse, dry, and fold, all while knowing more about your family's stains than any modern therapist. If you were wealthy, you had an entire staff, an army really, and they were absolutely responsible for protecting your public image one shirt at a time. Because here's the medieval truth: clean linen was a power flex. That sounds ridiculous, but imagine you're a noble showing up to court. Your shirt is bright, crisp, spotless. Everyone knows you can afford good soap. You have servants dedicated to scrubbing fabrics within an inch of their life, and you probably haven't touched a laundry paddle in your entire existence. Meanwhile, a lesser noble arrives looking like their tunic survived a minor flood. Embarrassing. Medieval fashion was a mess, but medieval laundry? That was political. Women and laundry, the gendered reality. We can't float through the topic without acknowledging one of the big everyday truths. Laundry was considered women's work. Not because women were naturally better at it, that was just the convenient excuse, but because men were simply not doing it. Full stop. The medieval division of labor was oddly consistent. Women washed, men dirtied things, women washed again, men added more mud because work, women sighed, the cycle continued forever. Even in monasteries, where men lived alone, the laundry was still assigned to specific monks as a duty, often seen as humbling, quiet, purifying work. Laundry was the spiritual version of sweeping a floor, calming, repetitive, impossible to mess up unless you boiled someone's favorite robe, which happened. And in noble households, laundry was managed almost entirely by women. Lower-class women scrubbed the fabrics. Middle-class wives supervised and mended. Upper-class ladies proudly did absolutely none of it. unless they were feeling pious and wanted to show off humility for about 10 minutes. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of, "I tried baking bread once, and it was very grounding." Let's drift calmly into medieval ironing. Ah yes, ironing. Everyone's least favorite modern chore. Except in the Middle Ages, it was even less fun. But somehow, the more miserable the task, the better it works for sleep. The medieval iron. Before fancy steam irons existed, people used smoothing stones and box irons. 1. Smoothing stones. These were literally smooth rocks, warmed by the fire. You'd glide the hot stone over linen until it behaved itself. Very herbal, very minimalist, very washed river rock from an overpriced spa gift shop. 2. Glass slickers. Clear glass tools used for pressing seams. Imagine ironing with a medieval paperweight. Extremely gentle, extremely breakable. 3. Box irons. These were metal irons with hollow centers. You filled them with burning coals, hot sand, or sometimes heated metal inserts. They worked surprisingly well. Also surprisingly dangerous. One distracted moment, and you'd scorch a week's worth of work. Very soothing to think about now, though. Ironing boards, medieval style. In case you're imagining a nice, collapsible, foam-padded board like you'd find at IKEA, no. Ironing boards were tabletops, wooden planks, benches, or even the floor. Sometimes, laundresses stretched linen across a piece of taut fabric or a thick blanket before smoothing it. No adjustable legs, no ergonomics, just a plank and a dream. The monotony is almost beautiful. Pleating, the medieval flex. If ironing wasn't tedious enough, medieval Europe went through fashion phases involving extreme pleats. Some so small, they looked like tiny fabric waves. These required damp cloth, small wooden rods, intense focus, and endless time. You'd wrap linen around rods, heat them gently, and wait for the pleats to set. This was the medieval equivalent of sitting for 4 hours while your hairstylist gives you micro braids nobody will fully appreciate. And yes, nobles expected their pleated cuffs to be crisp. Laundry staff prayed. Laundry staff suffered. Laundry staff produced immaculate pleats anyway. Hey guys, welcome back. Let's stretch our shoulders, breathe a little slower, maybe look vaguely toward the nearest pillow. Tonight, we're slipping deeper into the soft, lukewarm bathwater of medieval laundry, which somehow keeps getting weirder the longer we talk about it. Perfect for sleep. Terrible for actually doing laundry. All right, let's drift in. Laundry as social status, because even washing clothes had hierarchies. In the Middle Ages, you couldn't just wash clothes. Oh no, laundry was a whole ecosystem of class expectations. If you were poor, you washed your own clothes, probably in a river, probably while trying not to freeze, and probably while pretending your waterlogged wool tunic wasn't actively plotting to take you down with it. If you were moderately comfortable, you might send things to a local laundress. She'd soak, scrub, beat, boil, rinse, dry, and fold, all while knowing more about your family's stains than any modern therapist. If you were wealthy, you had an entire staff, an army really, and they were absolutely responsible for protecting your public image one shirt at a time. Because here's the medieval truth: clean linen was a power flex. That sounds ridiculous, but imagine you're a noble showing up to court. Your shirt is bright, crisp, spotless. Everyone knows you can afford good soap. You have servants dedicated to scrubbing fabrics within an inch of their life, and you probably haven't touched a laundry paddle in your entire existence. Meanwhile, a lesser noble arrives looking like their tunic survived a minor flood. Embarrassing. Medieval fashion was a mess, but medieval laundry? That was political. Women and laundry, the gendered reality. We can't float through the topic without acknowledging one of the big everyday truths. Laundry was considered women's work. Not because women were naturally better at it, that was just the convenient excuse, but because men were simply not doing it. Full stop. The medieval division of labor was oddly consistent. Women washed, men dirtied things, women washed again, men added more mud because work, women sighed, the cycle continued forever. Even in monasteries, where men lived alone, the laundry was still assigned to specific monks as a duty, often seen as humbling, quiet, purifying work. Laundry was the spiritual version of sweeping a floor. Calming, repetitive, impossible to mess up unless you boiled someone's favorite robe, which happened. And in noble households, laundry was managed almost entirely by women. Lower-class women scrubbed the fabrics. Middle-class wives supervised and mended. Upper-class ladies proudly did absolutely none of it, unless they were feeling pious and wanted to show off humility for about 10 minutes. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of, I tried baking bread once, and it was very grounding. Let's drift calmly into medieval ironing. Ah yes, ironing. Everyone's least favorite modern chore. Except in the Middle Ages, it was even less fun. But somehow, the more miserable the task, the better it works for sleep. The medieval iron. Before fancy steam irons existed, people used smoothing stones and box irons. 1. Smoothing stones. These were literally smooth rocks, warmed by the fire. You'd glide the hot stone over linen until it behaved itself. Very herbal, very minimalist, very washed river rock from an overpriced spa gift shop. 2. Glass slickers. Clear glass tools used for pressing seams. Imagine ironing with a medieval paperweight. Extremely gentle, extremely breakable. 3. Box irons. These were metal irons with hollow centers. You filled them with burning coals, hot sand, or sometimes heated metal inserts. They worked surprisingly well. Also surprisingly dangerous. One distracted moment, and you'd scorch a week's worth of work. Very soothing to think about now, though. Ironing boards, medieval style. In case you're imagining a nice, collapsible, foam-padded board like you'd find at IKEA, no. Ironing boards were tabletops, wooden planks, benches, or even the floor. Sometimes, laundresses stretched linen across a piece of taut fabric or a thick blanket before smoothing it. No adjustable legs, no ergonomics, just a plank and a dream. The monotony is almost beautiful. Pleating, the medieval flex. If ironing wasn't tedious enough, medieval Europe went through fashion phases involving extreme pleats. some so small they looked like tiny fabric waves. These required damp cloth, small wooden rods, intense focus, and endless time. You'd wrap linen around rods, heat them gently, and wait for the pleats to set. This was the medieval equivalent of sitting for 4 hours while your hairstylist gives you micro braids nobody will fully appreciate. And yes, nobles expected their pleated cuffs to be crisp. Laundry staff prayed. Laundry staff suffered. Laundry staff produced immaculate pleats anyway. Drying laundry. Wind, sun, and hope. Drying was deceptively simple, yet weirdly unreliable. 1. The sun method. Clothes were laid on grass to bleach gently in the sunlight. This worked beautifully, unless it rained, birds visited, insects decided to casually exist, or someone's goat wandered across the fabric. 2. The hedge method. Clothes hung on bushes or hedges. Very picturesque, also very prickly. 3. The rope line. A luxury in some places. Not everyone had rope to spare, and yes, rope was expensive. When they did hang laundry on lines stretched across courtyards or attics, fabric dried slowly in the cool air, the wet linen giving off that faint natural scent of, "This shirt survived." 4. Drying indoors. In winter or rain, people dried laundry above fires. This meant slower drying, smoky scent, occasional singeing, rustic ambiance. The medieval fire-drying method produced clothes that smelled heavily of campfire, but at least they were dry-ish. Let's drift to the economics of laundry. Laundry ions wasn't free. It wasn't even cheap. Soap ingredients cost money. Lye required ash collection. Fuel for boiling wasn't easy to acquire. Water rights existed in urban areas. Laundresses charged by the piece, or by the stain, which is both hilarious and reasonable. Even peasants calculated laundry carefully. A family might wash heavy linens monthly, outer garments seasonally, undergarments weekly or bi-weekly, wool garments only when absolutely required or after a traumatic sheep-related incident. Clothes lasted longer if you washed them less. And medieval people? They loved durability. This wasn't a throwaway culture. If you owned 2 shirts, congratulations, you were practically a fashion icon. Laundry fines and laws, because bureaucracy is eternal. To absolutely nobody's surprise, medieval towns had laws about laundry, because apparently people were too enthusiastic or too chaotic, or both. Some common regulations included no washing clothes upstream of drinking water areas. This one makes sense. You don't want soup tasting like someone's tunic. No beating laundry loudly late at night. Imagine the village trying to sleep while someone rhythmically wallops a shirt with a wooden paddle. Not calming. Fees for using public washhouses. Water infrastructure didn't maintain itself. Strict rules about where you could hang laundry. Some cities banned clotheslines across streets because nobles complained they were unsightly. Nothing ruins the ambiance of your medieval stroll like socks flapping in your face. Linen theft penalties. Stealing someone's drying shirt? Big fine. And yes, this happened often enough to require laws. Laundry thieves were apparently everywhere. The medieval version of people who steal Amazon packages. The smell of medieval laundry. Surprisingly pleasant. Well, sometimes. We usually imagine the Middle Ages smelling like a mix of mud, horses, and bad decisions. And, okay, that's partly accurate. But freshly washed laundry actually smelled nice. Why? Because people used herbs: lavender, sage, rosemary, mint, chamomile, marjoram. Sometimes flowers were added to rinse water to give linen a soft scent. It didn't overpower anything, but it added a hint of "someone tried." In fact, medieval herbal laundry practices are the ancestors of modern dryer sheets, just significantly less flammable. Let's drift into laundry tools. Picture a slow, peaceful montage of laundry tools: wooden tubs, steaming kettles, linen wringers, paddles worn smooth from years of use, heavy irons filled with coals, woven baskets full of damp shirts, and wide wooden drying racks. Some medieval households even had mangles, hand-cranked rollers used to squeeze water out of textiles. They were basically the medieval version of that pasta-making machine everyone buys and never uses. The sound of a mangle turning was steady, rhythmic, and deeply unexciting. Perfect for bedtime. The emotional side of laundry. This might sound overly sentimental, but laundry reveals a lot about people's lives. A noble's wardrobe displayed power, wealth, anxiety over appearances. A monk's robe showed devotion, humility, repetition. A peasant's patched tunic told survival, endurance, resourcefulness. Every stain had a story. Every mend had a reason. Every garment was a small biography in cloth. But we're keeping it sleepy, so just imagine all of that. Very slowly. Hey again, glad you're still awake, or maybe already pleasantly half asleep. Either way, let's drift right back into the oddly soothing world of medieval laundry. And tonight, in Part 4, we're going to glide deeper into the soft, moist chaos of drying clothes, in an era where humidity was basically a lifestyle choice, and mold was a permanent roommate. So let's ease back in. Maybe take a breath. The laundry continues. Drying laundry in the Middle Ages was, generously speaking, an adventure. And not an exciting adventure. More like the kind where nothing explodes, nothing resolves, and you just quietly accept that your tunic is going to be damp until spring. Medieval people, bless them, had hope. And that hope usually looked like a piece of rope, a drafty courtyard, and a prayer that the sun would show up at least once this month. Spoiler, it often didn't. Let's start with the simplest method: hanging things outside. Which sounds obvious, but remember, this was a world where weather forecasts didn't exist, and the climate often behaved like a bored cat knocking over cups just to watch people react. If a laundress managed to hang a sheet under clear skies, she knew she had, at best, a 50-50 chance it wouldn't be immediately drenched by a surprise drizzle that arrived with all the subtlety of a bucket. And there's something almost charming about the fact that medieval people didn't fully trust the outdoors. Dryers weren't a thing, obviously. Fire drying was possible, technically, but dangerous. Fabric plus fire plus wind equals a medieval insurance nightmare. So they relied on a cozy technique known as just hoping for the best. Wooden poles, hedges, bushes, and trees became unofficial community drying racks. If you've ever walked outside and seen your neighbor's bedsheets flapping on a line, imagine that, but everywhere. Courtyards filled with shirts, streets lined with hanging linens, entire alleys decorated in wet wool, dripping steadily onto passers-by who simply shrugged and kept walking. But drying indoors wasn't much better. Imagine your average medieval home, dark, smoky, and humid, with windows the size of modern iPads. Airflow wasn't exactly impressive. If anything, it felt like nature's slow cooker. Hanging your laundry inside meant your clothes absorbed every ambient smell. Smoke, stew, a hint of, "I haven't cleaned the rushes in 6 months," and the ever-present odor of damp timber. All of it carefully marinated into your favorite tunic. Delicious. Still, people did it anyway. They hung laundry from beams, rafters, chairs, ladders, doors, loose nails, wall pegs, anything that stood still long enough. A visitor walking into a medieval house often saw more laundry than actual furniture. And if you think that sounds cluttered, well, yes, it was. But practicality over aesthetics, as always. This indoor method also created an environmental phenomenon I like to call the medieval drizzle. Because even though garments were drying, they were also dripping. Onto everything. Floors became slick. Benches grew damp. Cats were unhappy. Air humidity rose to swamp-like levels, and many households developed that wonderful, familiar scent of slightly sour moisture that never fully goes away, no matter how many herbs you hang around the room. Speaking of herbs, drying laundry was also a chance to add a little fragrance, if you could afford it. Wealthier households sometimes scattered lavender or rosemary beneath drying linens. The idea wasn't so much to scent the laundry as to cope. If your sheets already smelled like wood smoke, sheep, yesterday's soup, and the local river, tossing in a handful of rosemary didn't fix the problem, but it made you feel like you were trying. And yes, there was a moment in medieval history where people believed drying laundry in the sun could kill bad vapors, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. The sun does kill bacteria, but the sun also occasionally disappeared for months, so it wasn't the most reliable team member. Now, here's something fun. Drying linens was so important that laws were written about it. In some towns, people weren't allowed to hang laundry in certain public squares or near major roads because it blocked foot traffic. Imagine a city council debating whether Agnes's overenthusiastic bedsheet usage constituted a civic hazard. And honestly, it probably did. Those things were huge. And while we're drifting through this damp world, let's casually slide over to the topic of ironing. Or should I say, the medieval attempt at ironing, because the results were mixed. Ironing as we know it today, using a flat metal tool heated on a stove, did exist in simple forms. But surprise, most people didn't do it. Because ironing required metal, heat, time, and a tolerance for burns. So the average peasant? Absolutely not. Their solution was gravity. Hang the clothing and let the wrinkles sort themselves out. If they didn't, congratulations, you were wrinkled, and no one cared. Wealthier households, however, had tools called linen smoothers, flat stones or glass discs rubbed over fabric to give it a cleaner look. Were they effective? Kind of, if you squint, but it was better than nothing. The more advanced families used mangle boards, long wooden planks paired with rollers. You wrapped fabric around the roller, pressed it with the board, and pushed or rocked it back and forth until the wrinkles surrendered out of sheer exhaustion. This method actually worked, well enough that some households used it for centuries, though it also meant that ironing day involved hours of slow, repetitive movements that probably doubled as a medieval Zen exercise. Ironing with heat was reserved for special garments, fine linens, noble outfits, or clothes worn to church, because of course, you had to look presentable in front of God, or at least less wrinkled than your neighbors. But even with all this effort, the concept of crisp, fresh, or clean-smelling clothing was, let's say, flexible. If you managed to get your laundry mostly clean, mostly dry, and mostly free of wrinkles, you were doing better than 85% of Europe. Let's also not overlook the eternal battle against mildew, the medieval nemesis. Clothing that dried too slowly grew little colonies of damp gremlins. People tried to fight this with herbs, smoke, scraping, sun exposure, and the ultimate medieval solution, shrugging and pretending it wasn't happening. Some garments simply never truly dried from November to March. They existed in a state of perpetual dampness, like a forest floor or a forgotten towel in a locker room. And then there was wool. Wool took days to dry. Days. Imagine hanging a cloak on Monday and still checking on it Thursday afternoon while muttering about the lack of sunlight. Wet wool also smelled powerful, like a sheep who had recently made some questionable life decisions. And everyone wore wool. So medieval towns had this ongoing, low-level aroma of warm moisture and resigned acceptance. But despite the difficulties, despite the damp winters and smoky interiors, laundry did eventually dry. Clothes did get worn again. Life moved forward at its steady, slightly soggy pace. And with that, we can gently drift toward the next step in our tour. The long, sleepy, endlessly repetitive process of folding, storing, and pretending everything was absolutely fine. Hey there, still drifting with me through the soft fog of medieval laundry? Nice. Settle in. Part 5 is going to be a gentle, slow glide into the final stretch of the washing journey. Folding, storing, and the strangely comforting monotony of maintaining a wardrobe in a world where most people owned, at best, 3 outfits and a dream. Let's ease back in. Maybe wiggle your shoulders. Maybe exhale. Good. We're going to wander through the quiet final steps of medieval laundry, where the pace slows down even further, because at this point, everyone involved is tired, damp, and kind of over it. Once laundry was finally dry, or dry enough, medieval enough being a very generous category, the next task was folding. And folding in the Middle Ages wasn't the obsessive, Pinterest-level process we imagine today. There were no crisp military folds, no Marie Kondo-style vertical organization, no sock burritos that spark joy. Medieval folding was functional, slow, and deeply unimpressed with itself. Peasants usually folded clothing into simple rectangles, or, honestly, whatever shape the fabric naturally wanted to collapse into. Tunics, shirts, aprons, headscarves, they were all flattened and stacked in small piles that lived either in a wooden chest, on a shelf, or in a corner that had been unofficially designated as the clean pile. And yes, the clean pile often sat right next to the not dirty enough to wash yet pile. Medieval storage was minimalistic, in a way that was less aesthetic and more necessity. Chests, those heavy, rectangular wooden boxes, were the backbone of clothing storage across all social levels. A medieval chest was basically a combination dresser, closet, suitcase, safe, bench, and coffee table. If you lived in the Middle Ages, you had a chest. If you were wealthy, you had several. If you were very wealthy, you had chests so beautifully carved that opening them probably felt like violating museum property. They were precious, sturdy, and also quite good at trapping moisture, insects, and the faintly swamp-like odor of linen that had not fully dried, but everyone had just silently agreed was fine. Inside these chests, people added little cloth bundles of herbs, not for luxury, but for survival. Lavender, mint, and wormwood helped keep moths away. Or at least, they tried. Moths in the Middle Ages operated like tiny, relentless vandals with wings. They loved wool. And wool was everywhere. So medieval people smelled like herbs, partly because they liked it, and partly because moths were waging a quiet but devastating textile war. Folding was also influenced by fabric type. Linen folded nicely, like a cooperative child. Wool folded less nicely. Wool had that stubborn thickness that made it puff up and resist all attempts at tidiness. You could fold a wool cloak 6 times and it would still bounce open like it was auditioning to be a very scratchy medieval spring. So households developed their own techniques, rolling cloaks instead of folding them, pressing garments under other heavy items, or, in some cases, simply draping the garment over a beam and calling it a day. And let's not forget that most households didn't have many clothes to store in the first place. A peasant might have 2 work outfits, one nicer set for church, and maybe a spare tunic for winter layering. That was it. When your entire wardrobe fits into a single chest with plenty of room to spare, folding becomes a lot less complicated. And the fewer things you own, the more you recognize each garment like an old friend. Ah, yes, my one shirt. We meet again. Wealthier families had far more clothing, of course. Lords, ladies, and anyone aspiring to impress the neighbors invested heavily in garments that showed off status. Bright dyes, embroidered hems, fancy trims, and expensive fabrics like silk. These pieces required much more careful storage. Some households wrapped special garments in linen to protect them. Others laid cloaks flat in large chests to avoid creasing the fabric. And noble women with multiple head coverings, veils, underdresses, outer dresses, and decorative gowns often needed servants just to keep track of which garment went where. There was also a social hierarchy of storage. Everyday clothing lived in accessible chests or hooks. Valuable clothing lived in guarded rooms. Royal clothing lived in storerooms that sometimes had appointed staff. Yes, medieval people literally hired professionals to stare at clothing and make sure nothing happened to it. Of course, the Middle Ages didn't yet have closets, wardrobes, or hangers as we know them. If you wanted to hang something, you improvised. Pegs on walls, wooden racks, ladder rungs, even the edge of a bed frame if you were feeling daring. Clothes that needed to be aired out were hung near windows, though window in this context means small hole in the wall covered by an oiled cloth that flapped angrily in the wind. Then comes the part of laundry that's weirdly soothing to think about: putting everything away. There was something quiet about it. After hours of washing, rinsing, beating, wringing, drying, and trying not to fall into a vat of soapy water, the simple act of folding and storing brought everything full circle. It meant the process was done. Until next week, or next month, or whenever the local stream warmed up again. And while today we measure laundry in loads per day, medieval people measured it in seasons. Laundry was done in big batches, not casual midweek refreshers. If you saw someone washing their clothing on a random Tuesday, you might assume something dramatic had happened, like they fell into a ditch, or a cow stepped on them, or they attended a feast and underestimated how messy stew eating can be when goblets, trenchers, and table manners are all questionable. As we drift through this slow final stage, you can almost picture a medieval woman, maybe a mother, maybe a servant, gently smoothing a shirt, folding it, stacking it, closing the chest with a soft thud, and wiping her hands on her apron. The day's work done. The garments ready to begin their brief window of being clean before life inevitably ruined them again. And that rhythm, wash, dry, fold, store, repeat, is one of the surprisingly universal human experiences across time. Laundry has always been a chore. It has always been endless. It has always been quietly tiring, and strangely comforting in its predictability.
Welcome back.
still drifting with me through the sudsy haze of medieval laundry. You've made it all the way to part 6, which means you're either very committed or very comfortably half asleep. Either way, perfect. Settle in. Take that slow inhale. Let the mind unclench a bit. Because now, we're going to wander gently into the softer edges of the medieval cleanliness universe. Soap making, everyday hygiene, and the ever-flexible definition of clean. Let's start with a word you probably know and probably love: soap. A modern miracle. A bubbly, scented delight. A magical substance that promises crushed lavender, coconut milk, oat extracts, and the vague idea of a spa. Medieval soap was not that. It was lumpy, grayish, slightly aggressive, and it felt like something between a damp brick and a stubborn cheese rind. But hey, progress has to start somewhere. Most medieval soap was made from animal fat, usually beef or mutton tallow, mixed with lye, a caustic substance extracted from wood ash. If you're thinking, wow, that sounds harsh, you're correct. Medieval soap did not care about your delicate sensibilities, or your skin moisture barrier, or your hopes, dreams, or epidermis. It was meant to cut grease, scrub grime, and remind you that comfort was not a medieval priority. Soap making was usually a small craft, handled by families or local artisans. Picture a quiet workshop with a big cauldron bubbling away, full of melted fat and alkaline sludge. A smell curling out into the village that said, "We are improving hygiene, but at what cost?" A smell that lingered in the air, the rafters, the clothing, the soul. And because soap was labor-intensive and slightly dangerous to produce, lye burns were not uncommon. It wasn't always cheap. Many peasants didn't even use soap regularly on clothing. They relied instead on lye water, chalk, or just good old-fashioned scrubbing until the fabric gave up and accepted its fate. That said, wealthier households did use soap more often. They even imported fancier varieties from the Mediterranean. Olive oil-based soaps like Castile, which were smoother and much gentler on fabrics. These soaps were considered so special that sometimes people kept them locked away so the wrong family members, or the servants, wouldn't accidentally waste them by, cleaning things. Now let's drift to smells, because medieval laundry was a constant negotiation with scents. People today often assume the Middle Ages just smelled terrible everywhere. And sure, there were odors, but medieval people did care about freshness. They just had limited tools to achieve it. Herbs were the go-to solution. Dried lavender, rosemary, mint, sage, sweet woodruff. People placed herbal sachets in chests, pockets, sleeves, and even inside hats. They sprinkled petals inside linens. They hung aromatic plants near beds or in washing rooms so that the scent, theoretically, would absorb into the fabric. Did it work? Well, partially. Very partially. But humans are optimists, and medieval humans were no exception. If a linen shift smelled like stale smoke but also a little like lavender, that counted as a win. If your cloak smelled like rain, sheep, smoke, and thyme, still a win. Layers of aromas were just part of life. And speaking of smoke, it's worth remembering that medieval households used smoke drying not just for meat, but sometimes for clothing. If the weather was cold or wet, laundry was occasionally hung near fireplaces. The heat helped dry the fabric. The smoke helped flavor it. This produced what we might politely call a robust aroma. Clothing came away with notes of oak, pine, and permanently lived in a chimney. Some people actually liked it, or pretended to. or were too busy to care. Let's slowly float into the topic of personal cleanliness, because laundry wasn't the only part of medieval life negotiating with water, soap, and hope. Bathing habits varied wildly depending on time, place, wealth, and general attitude toward being damp. Some medieval towns had public bathhouses. People would gather there, soak, scrub, gossip, conduct business, and occasionally forget the entire purpose of cleanliness and turn it into a social event. Bathhouses were warm, steamy, and slightly chaotic environments where you could relax in a tub while someone else scrubbed your back with a rough cloth and a soap that smelled like a combination of rendered fat and ambition. But not everyone used bathhouses. Some bathed at home, in a large wooden tub dragged in front of the fire and filled with heated water bucket by bucket. This was a luxury, time-consuming and resource-heavy. If you've ever carried a pot of soup from the stove to the table, imagine carrying that repeatedly, but it's water and it sloshes everywhere, and you're trying not to scorch your feet. Many peasants bathed seasonally, which is a polite way of saying not often. But before judging, remember that medieval life involved layers of clothing, outdoor labor, limited access to clean water, and a climate that could be punishing. Staying clean was work, hard work, and when things are that difficult, you don't do them just because it's a Wednesday. Instead, people relied on linen shifts and shirts, their undergarments, and washed those regularly. Clean linen next to the skin absorbed sweat, dirt, and oils, and because linen is magical, scientifically it's antimicrobial and dries fast, people stayed cleaner than you'd expect. Washing the inner layers kept the body relatively fresh, or at least fresh-ish, clean adjacent, good enough for a world without deodorant. Let's wander into soap for the body, because medieval hygiene wasn't all or nothing. People did wash their hands, faces, and hair, just not always with soap. Soap for the body could be harsh, so people used alternatives: warm water, herbs, vinegar rinses, or even sand or ash for scrubbing. Please don't try that at home. Wealthier individuals used scented oils, which made them smell lovely and slightly greasy, like historical moisturized rotisserie chickens. And yes, people in the Middle Ages did care about their appearance. They brushed their teeth with rough pastes or cloths. They combed their hair. They trimmed their nails. They took pride in looking presentable because society is society, no matter the century. Laundry was a part of that ritual, the final step in a long chain of efforts to feel vaguely clean and socially acceptable. As we drift toward the quiet end of Part 6, we're left with this surprisingly cozy picture of medieval cleanliness. A workshop where soap bubbles away, clothes drying by the fire, fresh herbs tucked into corners, a linen shirt folded and placed gently into a carved chest, a family settling into bed, knowing tomorrow they won't have to wash a single thing. Unless the dog gets into the mud again, or the toddler spills broth, or the weather ruins everything, which it probably will. Laundry was never glamorous, but it was steady, rhythmic, the kind of task that shaped daily life in ways so subtle you almost miss them.
Welcome back for the final drift, Part 7. If you're still awake, congratulations. Sort of. If you're very sleepy, even better. That means the medieval laundry has officially done its job. So let's slowly wander into the last layer of this strange, sudsy world, the social side of laundry, the community bonds it created, and the way this simple task quietly held medieval life together. Take one last deep breath. Settle your shoulders. Let's glide. Laundry wasn't just a chore in the Middle Ages. It was a social event, a seasonal ritual, and in many ways the quiet heartbeat of everyday life. Because while medieval people didn't gather for yoga classes or book clubs or bring your own charcuterie nights, they absolutely gathered for laundry. And honestly, it wasn't that different. It was just wetter and colder and involved a lot more elbow grease. Let's start with the simple truth. Nobody wanted to wash laundry alone. It was exhausting, time-consuming, and, depending on the weather, mildly miserable. So families, neighbors, and sometimes entire communities ended up doing it together. You'd see groups of women at the riverbanks working side by side, beating linens on stones, wringing tunics, rinsing cloaks, and chatting about everything from local gossip to family troubles to who exactly tracked mud across the church floor last Sunday. These communal laundry days were one of the few times people, especially women, could socialize without judgment. You could complain about your husband. You could complain about your neighbor. You could complain about the price of grain or the difficulty of finding decent wool or how Agnes still hasn't returned your bucket even though you asked her 3 times. All perfectly acceptable topics. Laundry was basically the medieval version of a group chat. And these laundry gatherings weren't just for peasants. Even in wealthier communities, servant staffs washed clothing in groups, working in rotations, sharing tools, and coordinating huge loads of linens that belonged to noble households. Imagine washing the equivalent of a small castle's worth of bedding. Just sheets everywhere, mountains of sheets. You'd need teamwork, stamina, and a strong sense of humor, or at least a willingness to ignore the fact that the Duke's teenager definitely spilled something alarming on his pillow. In cities, people often washed laundry at public fountains or designated washing areas. These spaces were bustling, noisy, and strangely lively, much like the modern laundromat, but with more cows wandering by and a higher risk of falling into the water. And because everyone washed clothing in public, laundry became a window into social status. People judged each other's fabrics, stains, colors, and every once in a while quietly admired a particularly nice tunic someone had inherited or somehow afforded. Clothing revealed things. Who was wealthy? Who was struggling? Who had been to market recently? Who had married into a better family? And who probably should have washed their cloak last month? This wasn't just fashion, it was social information. Laundry also served as a kind of seasonal marker. Spring, time to scrub the heavy wool cloaks that survived winter. Summer, ideal for drying linens in the sun. Autumn, the last chance to wash everything before the weather turned against you. Winter, good luck, unless you liked wearing clothes that froze solid outdoors and thawed indoors like medieval laundry popsicles. And then there were the people whose entire livelihood revolved around laundry. Professional washerwomen. These women hired themselves out to wealthier households, monasteries, and even universities to wash clothing for others. Their lives were physically demanding, scrubbing, hauling water, carrying heavy loads, and dealing with stains caused by substances politely known as medieval life. But despite the hard work, washerwomen often had more independence than other workers. They set their own routines. They handled money directly. They were respected, though sometimes in that way society respects necessary tasks without ever fully appreciating them. Some washerwomen became so skilled that they were sought after, especially for handling fine linens, expensive gowns, or religious garments that required gentle care. If you entrusted your velvet doublet or embroidered veil to someone, you wanted it to return in one piece. Washerwomen had reputations, and if they ruined a noblewoman's headscarf, word spread fast. Laundry also intersected with religion. Monasteries had orderly laundry routines, complete with assigned days, strict guidelines, and detailed notes about cleanliness. Nuns and monks washed their clothing as an act of humility and discipline. It was practical, sure, but also symbolic, cleansing the body to reflect a cleansed soul. Though let's be honest, some monks definitely scrubbed their robes while thinking very ordinary thoughts like, why is cold water even colder at 6 a.m.? And then there were customs and superstitions. Medieval people had numerous beliefs about when and how to wash things. Some thought washing on certain feast days brought bad luck. Others believed specific herbs added to rinse water protected garments from evil. Some communities forbade washing clothes on Sundays. And every once in a while, a local rule popped up banning laundry in particular rivers because someone got annoyed that their livestock kept eating soaked grass downstream. Medieval life was full of small, oddly specific problems. Let's float into one more quiet corner of laundry life: children, because medieval children were experts at making laundry worse. Toddlers got dirty just by existing. They rolled in mud, they spilled food, they chased animals, they inexplicably found every puddle within a 5-mile radius. And baby clothing? That required constant washing, thanks to the never-ending disasters that come with infancy. Medieval parents didn't have diapers in the modern sense. They had cloth wraps, swaddles, and a lot of patience. Laundry day was both a necessity and a surrender. But with all this effort, scrubbing, drying, folding, storing, talking, complaining, and occasionally chasing a goat away from the rinse water, laundry created a rhythm that shaped medieval life in a surprisingly soothing way. It was repetitive, predictable, and communal. Tasks that looked dull and endless from afar were woven into the calm, steady cycle of survival. When your day was done, you could picture a small village settling down. Cleanish shirts tucked into chests, fresh-ish linens fluttering lightly in the evening breeze, washerwomen packing up their tools, neighbors carrying home damp baskets while chatting about dinner, and the soft sound of water still dripping from a stubborn wool cloak that refused to dry before nightfall. Laundry was humble, quiet, ordinary, but it tied people together through shared work, shared stories, and shared effort to stay at least moderately clean in a world that didn't make cleanliness easy. And maybe that's why, in a strange way, medieval laundry makes such a comforting bedtime story. It's slow, rhythmic, predictable. No battles, no loud surprises, just people doing their best with what they had, repeating the same motions their parents and grandparents did, carving a bit of order out of the constant messiness of daily life. So as we close this long, soft journey through tubs, rivers, wringers, beams, herbs, and smoke-dried shirts, try to imagine the quiet at the end of wash day. The world gets still. The water settles. The fire dims. Clothes rest in their chests. And for one brief moment, everything is clean enough. Thanks for wandering through the medieval laundry cycle with me. Now, feel free to drift off. Your work here is done.